Hi, I'm Lindsay from American Patchwork and Quilting, and welcome to week 1 of the Twice the Fun Quilt-Along. And this week we are assembling triangle squares. And this quilt has a lot of triangle squares, so we wanted to share some tips right away to make them easier and more accurately so that you can continue with this pattern in confidence. Tip 1. Make your triangle squares larger than needed and then trim them down to size. So to do this, you want to cut your initial squares 1/8 of an inch larger than it says in the pattern, and then assemble them as you normally would, and then you want to square them down to the right size. So there's a few different ways to do this. If you're using your plain acrylic ruler, you just want to line up the 45-degree line with the center diagonal line on your triangle square and then trim it to the right size. There are also a lot of templates on the market for trimming various sizes of triangle squares. So you can buy one of these or grab one from your sewing room if you have one already and trim them down quickly. And while this does take a little extra time and a little more fabric, the precision is worth it for a lot of quilters. Tip 2. Make fast work of drawing your diagonal lines. So most patterns will tell you to mark a diagonal line through the center of your squares, and then you sew 1/4 inch away from the lines on both sides. So you have a few options for marking. I just sometimes like to use a plain old pencil, but you can do a air or water soluble marking tool, or you can even do a Hera marker, which leaves indents in your fabric, not visible markings. So this is a great option too. And then I like to make quick work by aligning a lot of squares up on my cutting mat with the corners all on the same line. And then you can just align your ruler corner to corner through all the squares and then mark multiples at a time. So that makes it a little quicker. If you're struggling with getting accurate triangle squares, you can also mark the stitching lines instead of the diagonal line through the center. So to do this, you just line up the 1/4 inch mark on your ruler with the corner and then mark that line. That's your stitching line on this side. And then you'll do the same for the other side. 1/4 inch away, mark that stitching line. And that can just help if you're struggling with your triangle squares turning out the right size. Tip 3, use a scant seam allowance. And I know a scant seam allowance seems scary to some quilters, and you may not have to worry about this. So if your triangle squares are coming out the exact right size, don't do this step. But if they're turning out a little smaller than they should be, you want to use a scant seam allowance. So to do this, you will sew just a few threads narrower, just a little bit narrower than that 1/4 inch from those diagonal lines. And this will help make up for the extra bulk of the thread you're using and the extra bulk from pressing the seam if you're not getting really flat open seams. So we do recommend that when you're doing this, you still check the size of your finished squares and trim them if needed. But sometimes that scant 1/4 inch can just help get our squares the most accurate size they can be. Tip 4, set your seams when you're pressing. So to do this, you want to press on top of the stitching line first, and that just helps the stitching sink into the fabric. And that way, when you press your seam of the triangle square, you'll have a smooth, clean, straight diagonal line through the center of the square. Tip 5, cut off those dog ears or that excess triangle that result when you're piecing triangle squares. And this will allow you to piece these with other units with more precision. And of course, if you made your squares larger and trimmed them down to size, you'll have already trimmed off those dog ears. And finally, when you're sewing these triangle squares to other units that may have a lot of seams, which you will later in this quilt-along, we recommend starting to sew the leader strip so you get a nice clean start. So I just like to use a scrap of fabric. You just start sewing on this strip and then you'll add your other units that you're sewing together. And if for some reason your machine is having trouble getting over those bulky sections where all the seams meet, you can use this leader strip to just gently pull and guide the pieces through the machine. We hope these tips help as you sew triangle squares for this quilt. We can't wait to see your progress, and find more details and join this quilt along on our website at allpeoplequilt.com/twicethefun.